Good afternoon. My name is Matt Abbott. I'm the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us via Zoom. The Council is honored to partner with the Foreign Policy Research Institute for this timely discussion on COVID-19's impact on the intelligence community. In the interest of public health and in accordance with CDC guidelines, the Council made the decision to cancel all of our in-person public events through at least June 5th. Please check our website and social media pages for updates, as well as for new podcasts, events, blogs, and research. And thank you to our members who are tuning in. Right now, we need your support and engagement more than ever, and we hope you will keep us in mind as you help to keep nonprofits operating in this challenging time. Now, on to today's program. Our speaker today is Carol Rollie Flynn. This program is on the record and being recorded, and after about 20 minutes of discussion, we'll incorporate questions from the audience. You can submit your questions by typing ccga.live into your browser. Now, before we begin our program, I'd like to introduce our guest. Carol Rollie Flynn is the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. She is a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. There, she held senior executive positions, including director of CIA's Leadership Academy, director of the Office of Foreign Intelligence Relationships, associate deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center, executive director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, and chief of station in major posts in Southeast Asia and Latin America. Rollie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Matt. Pleased to be here.
Thank you. To start, what role does the intelligence community play in a public health crisis like the one we're currently facing?
Thanks. Good question, and not an obvious answer probably to most of our viewers today. Before I answer, let me first do my disclaimer that even though I spent 30 years with the CIA and the U.S. government, I'm no longer an employee, so my views are my own personal views, don't represent the U.S. government. And also in that I'm affiliated with the Foreign Policy Research Institute based in Philadelphia, and we are a nonpartisan organization. So if I say something that strikes you as political, it's not intended to be so. So I'll try to keep this nonpartisan to the degree I can. So the intelligence community. Why the intelligence community? Well, pandemic. It's international. It spreads across borders. It affects our relationships with foreign countries, foreign leaders. And the intelligence community does two big things. It collects information and it analyzes that information, and so that policymakers can make decisions, make informed decisions. They can anticipate and know in advance, ideally, things that might happen, but at least know how to think about them. Understanding the plans and intentions of foreign governments and foreign leaders. In the case of this particular crisis, there's a great deal of information. There's so much out there that you might ask, well, what role could the intelligence community play? There's already so much. The governments are producing information. You can go on the Johns Hopkins website and see all this incredible data. Well, I would say, yeah, there's all that data, but how much of that data is accurate? Are countries reporting accurately? Are leaders, what are foreign leaders really thinking, and what are their plans and intentions? So two things. One of the things, and I'll talk mostly about the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, because that's the part of the intelligence community I know best. And the CIA does what we call human intelligence. That's the clandestine recruitment and clandestine handling of sources who give us secret information, hopefully in a timely way so that we can anticipate and keep our policymakers fully informed. So we develop secret information that puts everything in perspective and ideally gives us plans, intentions of foreign governments, foreign leaders, and allies and adversaries. We also, the intelligence community and the CIA, analyze. They analyze all that information, try to make sense of it, figure out what's true, might not be true. And in an age where there is so much data, it's very different from, say, the Cold War in the 50s, where there was a paucity of data, where you had to kind of read tea leaves to figure out what was going on. Nowadays, there's so much data, and our analysts now, thankfully, we have a lot of technical tools we didn't used to have, and AI, that we can make sense of all that data. But at the same time, not just the public data, but the secret information that our human sources provide.
Thank you. And you mentioned that human intelligence collection. How do you foresee the nature of human intelligence collection changing during this time of social isolation? And how can disruptions to human intelligence collection, especially that which is done in person, be mitigated while still protecting sources?
Boy, that's the million-dollar question, too. Again, I'm no longer with the CIA, so I'm speaking in terms of what I used to do when I used to be a case officer and have to be out on the streets handling clandestinely recruiting and clandestinely handling sources. First of all, recruiting sources and human is an essentially social activity. The process of what we would call developing and recruiting sources, identifying, developing, and recruiting sources, really comes down to building close relationships and building trust to the point that a person feels comfortable exceeding their brief with you. And that applies both to individual sources as well as to parts of governments, that they will be willing to work with you because they trust you. I personally think it's pretty hard to develop that kind of trust through a virtual interaction, although I suppose it's doable. Let's get down, though, to handling our sources. I mean, when you're out on the street, if you're out on the street trying to have a clandestine meeting with a source, I just think of what it's like now in Philadelphia. I look out my window down on the streets and there's nobody out there. And if part of it is blending into the crowd. And if there's no crowd to blend into and it's only you and your source who are out there on the street, and if policemen or security authorities are stopping people and asking them what they're doing, that to me sounds like a nightmare for running a human operation. Now, and I'm not giving anything away here, but in what we would call our denied areas, like Moscow would be a perfect example, where there's a government that is very interested in finding out what we're doing, especially if we have sources, what we call agents, who are penetrations of that government, and there's surveillance all over us. And in those kind of situations where we rely on what we would call impersonal communication, that's the stuff of spy novels and movies with dead drops and signals, chalk marks on mailboxes and walls, and coded signals that you put on the street. That too gets a little dicey. And even as has been written about in books like The $1 Billion Spy, sometimes even in places like Moscow, there are brief encounters, a few whispered words to your source. Well, that's kind of hard to do when you're social distancing, because if you're 6 feet apart, you're going to have to be yelling. And that's in and of itself not clandestine. Now, I am certain, I would like to think the CIA has forms of secret communications that I'm not aware of and I'm not at liberty to talk about, but certainly street operations, I would think, would be affected in this climate.
Absolutely.
I might also add, if you're traveling into a country, and if upon arrival they're putting something on your cell phone, and we know this, and doing contact tracing and all that kind of thing, that's not conducive to clandestine operations either.
Absolutely. What impact do you think this pandemic will have on the recruitment and training of future intelligence officers? And what about the recruitment of sources and agents?
Well, on recruiting new officers, I think the whole upfront piece of that is done online. So I think that can probably proceed. But after you get to a certain point in the employment process where it's looking like they're really probably going to, they're thinking seriously of hiring you, there are stages where they start doing interviews, usually at least several interviews with you. There's something, the polygraph, most members of the IC have to take a polygraph. And to my knowledge, there's not yet the technology to do that virtually. And then there's the background investigation, where a background investigator actually goes out and interviews people, your neighbors and friends and former employers. So I would think the final stages of employment processing, the application process, would be slowed at this point.
And with so much work being conducted online now, do you think communications intelligence and signals intelligence collection will play a more prominent role in the future of intelligence gathering?
It may, but I would hasten to add a caveat to that. I remember, a couple decades ago when maybe a little longer ago than that, I'm dating myself, but when people used to talk about SIGINT, and they would always say, oh, signals intelligence, that's intercepts. SIGINT doesn't lie. Well, people lie. And so if you're listening to an intercepted communication, yeah, they might have said that, but they may have been lying. And so that's where human really has its value, because it can provide context. It can provide, he said that, but I could tell he was kidding, or he winked at me as he said it. So SIGINT can never completely replace the other parts of the intelligence community. Human being one of the smallest and one of the cheapest, but it really does give you the context and can get at plans and intentions in a way that the other ints usually can't.
On that note, are professionals in the intelligence community, ranging from intelligence officers to analysts, equipped to work from home if needed? And if yes, does this create vulnerabilities that adversaries can potentially exploit?
Candidly, I don't know the answer to that question because I'm no longer there. I hope they have the capability to do so, but when I was at the agency, we did not work from home. We worked in SCIFs, sensitive compartmented information facilities, that are places that have been approved by the government to meet certain standards, where you can talk about and handle classified information. Anything outside of a SCIF is not as secure, inherently not as secure. Although, even in a SCIF, if you've got one of the people in there who's been recruited by the Russians, for instance, even then it's not completely secure.
And while this current pandemic situation is unprecedented, intelligence agencies are used to operating in challenging and rapidly evolving environments. Are there any lessons that the private sector could learn from how intelligence agencies operate in these circumstances?
Interesting question. Hard question. The intelligence community does not operate on it's not cost effective in profit and loss terms the way the private sector would look at it. In other words, to really do intelligence right, to be absolutely, sure of getting in front of and anticipating potential crises and issues, you really want to have resources in every corner of the globe and redundancy. But that's costly. And you can put resources out there that you may never use. They're there just in case. And in the intelligence community, we've gone back and forth in terms of how much is spent on intelligence in our country, depending really on the perception of threat by the American people. For instance, in the 90s, the so-called peace dividend of the fall of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, when spending on intelligence went down. People didn't feel the same threat. But post 9/11, all that spending came back again. And again, if you recall, after 9/11, everybody was talking about failure to connect the dots, which is another important aspect to the intelligence community and pandemic response, and beyond the intelligence response. This is a classic issue that requires a whole of government response, where people do need to be coordinating with each other.
What impact do you anticipate this pandemic will have on terrorist groups and other non-state actors with malignant intentions?
I can think about that in basically two ways. One, the United States right now has its hands full dealing with the pandemic. So they may think the US is distracted and use that vacuum to do things. Recruit, build, get ready, plan attacks, carry out attacks. However, in a lot of the areas of the world where terrorist activity takes place, which is basically anywhere, at the same time, those terrorists are going to be affected by the pandemic as well. I was looking at a map the other day, and I see Somalia seems to only have a very small dot. And I think of Somalia as an example because terrorism seems to rise in ungoverned spaces. And so maybe, Somalia doesn't have it yet, or it's a matter of the reporting is not reliable. Because certainly Somalis have connections with the Gulf and other parts of Africa, so I think it's just a matter of time. And so I think the impact of the pandemic, when it hits areas like that, it's going to be very dire because they don't have infrastructure or working public health systems and hospitals to deal with it. So if you look at terrorism and the reasons why terrorism springs up, it often springs up in areas where there are perceived injustices, long-held, antagonisms, and that kind of thing. So I could see this as ultimately giving rise to more terrorist activity.
And do you foresee states who are adversarial to the United States using this as an opportunity to take actions against the U.S.?
Maybe not actions, but certainly to do things while we're distracted. I also see, governments, authoritarian governments, and we see this with Viktor Orban in Hungary, Putin in Russia, where they're using this as an opportunity to consolidate their power and develop more authoritarian systems. China, it's safe cities, technology. Certainly, they used a lot of surveillance of the public to using the pandemic as a reason to rely more heavily on that. North Korea, I wouldn't, while the cat's away, the mice will play. So I would not rule out that they might, use this as an opportunity, again, while the U.S. is distracted, to resume some of their nefarious activities.
Absolutely. Are there any contingency plans in place in the event senior intelligence officials or a significant proportion of intelligence officers are incapacitated due to coronavirus?
I don't know, but I certainly hope so. I do know, that from my own former home agency, the CIA, we're all about preparedness. I mean, that intelligence itself is preparedness. And so I certainly hope they have plans for something like that, but I don't know.
And on that preparedness note, do you feel that America's intelligence community was prepared for this particular pandemic?
Candidly, I don't know. If I can believe the press reports are that they provided intelligence briefings to the Hill, and I'm assuming to policymakers on this pandemic. Certainly, even with open source information, it was pretty clear that there was something going on in Wuhan, and so I'm assuming they would have been picking up on that.
Before we open it up to questions from the audience, which can be submitted at ccga.live, can you tell us what do you feel are the biggest challenges this presents for the intelligence community, and what are the biggest opportunities?
I think the biggest challenges could be resources, simply because when 9/11 happened, I think a lot of the government lost some resources. The intelligence community was the beneficiary of that, because a lot of new resources came to us. In this particular crisis, I think it's possible the intelligence community could lose some resources. But again, I don't know. That's pure speculation. In terms of opportunities, again, it's like 9/11. It's an opportunity for greater partnership with other parts of government, and with our foreign allies as well. We have very strong intelligence relationships with countries around the world, particularly our allies.
Well, thank you very much for that. We'll now open it up to questions from the audience. Again, please feel free to submit your questions at ccga.live. Our first question is, in your opinion, how does the removal this past weekend of Michael Atkinson, who was the former Intelligence Community Inspector General, affect our ongoing response to COVID-19 and other security threats?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm not privy, other than what's in the press, to why he was removed. But he was appointed. He's a political appointee, so the administration, any administration, has the power to remove and political appointees in particular. I can only speculate that the pandemic was a distraction, and it was a time when maybe they thought it would fly under the radar and not be noticed. Other than that, my response would be pure speculation.
Next question from the audience. What do you Surgeon General's comment that this is our Pearl Harbor moment, or this is like 9/11? Do you feel that the pandemic is like those events?
It's like those events, but I think it's so much greater. I mean, in every way. I mean, 9/11, as horrific as it was, those were isolated attacks. They did identify a larger threat against United States interests, both at home and abroad, and perhaps made it more the public more cognizant of that threat. However, this is a worldwide pandemic. This has implications for everyone in the world, and I think it has implications for every part of the U.S. government and every corner of U.S. society and the economy. I mean, this to me is so much larger, and I think it's hard to foresee all the short and long-term impacts that this will have.
Thank you. Next question is, what role do you think the intelligence community can and should play in countering disinformation and assisting agencies like the CDC, the World Health Organization, to counter and shut down any disinformation campaigns that state or non-state actors might be putting out in response to the pandemic?
Yeah, well, the CIA, and I'll talk about the CIA. The CIA, of course, reports on disinformation perpetrated by foreign entities. And so one role is to inform policymakers, and policymakers include seniors in CDC and other government agencies and entities to inform them so that they're aware of this, and inform policymakers so that they can make then decisions on how to deal with this kind of disinformation. In terms of the CIA cannot be seen to be operating in a way that influences the American public. That's outside of their purview. But again, in terms of tracking that kind of disinformation activity and informing policymakers who can then act on it and decide how they'll deal with it, the CIA does do that.
Thank you. And next question is, can you speak a bit to how the intelligence community foresaw the current pandemic? There were reports that the situation in China was included in intelligence reports for the president since the end of January or early February.
I don't know, because I wasn't there and I'm no longer working there, but I'm sure it was in intelligence reports. It was, obviously a country like China is a country that's very important to our policymakers, and therefore the CIA no doubt would have been writing reports on it. And given that there was a crisis going on, which I find completely believable that they would have been following that and including it in their publications for policymakers.
You were formerly the director of the CIA's Leadership Academy. Can you tell us some of the leadership characteristics that our country's leaders and also our intelligence leaders should be exhibiting right now during this crisis?
Oh, well, what a good question. I think, people talk about traits of leaders. I think vision is really important, but also communication right now, I think, is so important. When leading the country, it's not just top-down communication, but bottom-up communication, listening to what people are saying, listening to what's going on. So I think communication is obviously very important. I think some of the greatest leaders in our history have been inspiring leaders as well, to inspire us to be our best selves in a crisis like that. And I think at a time like this, when we and the whole world are under such threat, I think inspiring people to do the right thing and providing that kind of moral leadership, I think, is really important.
Thank you. Next question is, with this pandemic, do you believe or foresee that the national leadership will assign new priorities to the intelligence community to collect and analyze information about pandemics, about disease, and also foreign government policies related to this?
I can only look into my crystal ball, but I would say 100%. I have no doubt that that will be on the intelligence community's priorities. But again, a lot of that information is overtly available. So what the intelligence community will be asked to do is to collect and analyze, to collect the information that's not readily available in the media or in openly available internet sources. Particularly the CIA will be asked to get that information that's secret and timely, and fills niche information needs of our policymakers.
Thank you. Next question is, does the intelligence community have any tools that it could bring to bear on organizing research into treatments for the coronavirus, or to inform the U.S. research community and the private sector?
I don't know. I candidly don't know. In terms of actual scientific research, the CIA has long had a directorate of science and technology, but it has been more around tools for collection or tools for helping us enhance the clandestinity of our operations, as opposed to trying to find trying to find cures and medical information, scientific information related to the disease. I do know that, and I forget the details, but this was a long time ago. This was like in the 1980s or 1990s, when some of our technology that the CIA had developed, or I think it was the CIA, maybe it was the intelligence community, some part of the intelligence community had developed, which was useful in medical diagnostics, for instance, of breast cancer. So occasionally there's something that's incidentally helpful to other things. But in terms of specifically being tasked to go after scientific information, I don't know.
Thank you. How does the intelligence community balance the national interest with the global public good in managing a global pandemic like this? And what's the role of cooperating with intelligence agencies around the world to address this challenge?
The challenge is the collection on the global pandemic. Let me go to partnering and collaborating with our foreign partners. That's a very important part of the intelligence community, partnering with our foreign counterparts overseas. If you look at me and you think of all the places where we want to know information, you can look at me and you can see right away, I don't blend in. I don't speak the languages. I don't understand every culture in the world. And we've historically had intelligence relationships with other countries, just as we've had law enforcement relationships with other countries, because there are always topics that will be mutually of interest. Law enforcement, drug trafficking, terrorism. And so our foreign partners, I suspect, will be very helpful to us. Our foreign partners can often go places we can't go either around the world, so we do rely on them.
Thank you. Next question is, what advice would you give to young professionals who are pursuing or thinking of pursuing a career in the intelligence community during this uncertain time?
I'd say apply. And there are all kinds of people I know who applied, got rejected, applied again, and got a job. There are, I don't know what the number is now. The last time I heard it was like 150,000 applications to the CIA every year for a handful of jobs, really, relatively. And so I would say apply. All the applications are done on the website. I would say keep your nose clean, no drugs, don't do drugs. I think they've got a policy where you can't have done drugs for the last year. And remember, marijuana is still against the federal law. It's a federal crime to use marijuana. So keep your nose clean. And if you apply, and if you have something in your past, a lot of us have a past, don't lie about it. Be truthful. Things can get forgiven. But keep your nose clean. If you're interested in the CIA, for instance, and working overseas, take an interest in international affairs, learn a language. Well, maybe not right now, travel overseas, but travel or work overseas. Another thing I would say to the young folks, the CIA rarely hires people straight out of college. They want people who've actually worked in the world for a while, have some street smarts, and are a little more mature. So if you're really interested in a career in the intelligence community or the CIA, I would say go out and experience life a bit. Get a good job, ideally do things that give you some international exposure. Learn a language. If you have a hard language, you've got a leg up. So that's what I would recommend.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, can you speak to how scenario-based training helps prepare leaders to be agile enough to react to uncertainty and unknown novel risks like we're facing now?
Oh, I'm a big believer in scenario training, simulations, and that kind of thing, because they force you to think through contingencies. They also can, for instance, if you do sort of either case studies or simulations, they force you to react to situations and play your roles so that you can anticipate. First of all, you can find gaps in your own organization, and anticipate what you're going to need to get through a real crisis. For instance, I have done, some simulations around cyber security crises, and I can't tell you how many times the same two things come up in those kinds of scenario trainings. One is nobody knows who's in charge. And usually there's, in everybody's business continuity plan or emergency action plan, some official or some position is usually designated as the person to be in charge. And if you don't have that, people don't know what the right hand doesn't know left hand. So that's really important. The other thing I have found when I was doing scenario training, I started having people always bring their emergency action plan, a hard copy of it to the exercise, as well as if they had a business continuity plan, because I found too many times that nobody knew what it was or had read it. You'd be in the middle of an exercise and you'd say, well, what does it say in your emergency action plan? And they'd say, I don't know, I've never seen it. So that was one of the lessons I would say.
Thank you. With your experience in counterterrorism, do you see an evolution in lone wolf terrorism and these types of plots moving forward with the unique environment in which we're currently operating?
I don't know. I don't know in terms of how the current pandemic would affect that all, and I can only speculate. Lone wolves are, by their name, generally isolated actors, and I can only imagine that, left on their own and not having to actually go to work now, that there could be sort of a surge in lone actors. But the one thing missing is the opportunity. Where do you go perpetrate your lone terrorist attack? There's, people aren't out on the street much. I suppose you could do, hacktivist kind of stuff, hacking websites, and that's, virtual terrorism of sorts. But it's hard to say. I'm not sure. Usually, long-term resentment, sometimes, borderline mental illness can lead to lone wolf terrorism. Isolation and social isolation, though, is often one of the traits of lone wolf terrorists.
Thank you. How do you foresee this pandemic will change the relationship between the U.S. and China, and also the U.S. and Russia?
Ooh, that's $1 million question. I don't know. Certainly looking at China, the relationship, it seems to operate on two levels. There's been a lot of China bashing going on in the administration, some for good reason. But at the same time, we're getting humanitarian assistance from China. China's sending us medical supplies. So it almost operates at two levels. My sense is that President Trump admires Xi Jinping, President Xi, and certainly I think respects them as a formidable, adversary, partner, whatever. So I think, though, again, this is an international crisis, and we have to, the solutions aren't going to be solely within our country. We've got to have international solutions and international partners. On Russia, kind of the same thing. Russia has not been as vocal in this crisis. It's unclear. That's another example of, based on the data that's coming out, it's at least the overt data that we're all seeing, those of us who aren't part of the intelligence community. It's hard to know exactly what the impact is in Russia. So to me, it's hard to anticipate what that relationship is going to be.
Thank you. Going back to China, how do you see the effects of the pandemic impacting China's national goals and objectives, specifically with the South China Sea, as well as the Belt and Road Initiative? And do you assess that China's response to the pandemic may exacerbate regional tensions as well?
That's an interesting question. I'm not a China expert, so I'll say that right up front. I think this crisis is going to hit China hard. I mean, there are obviously some indications of some recovery, but certainly everybody is re-examining supply chains. And also China is very, very sensitive. Chinese leaders historically have been very sensitive to any kind of internal unrest or internal unhappiness, and any kind of upticks in the unemployment rate in China has always been a concern of Chinese leaders because of their fear that it could fuel internal dissent, internal unrest. In fact, some would posit that the Belt and Road Initiative is part and parcel of Chinese leadership desire to have a full employment program for their population. So, I mean, time will tell. None of us has a crystal ball to look in to see what the ultimate long-term economic impacts are going to be. But certainly China's leaders are very sensitive to any kind of downturn in the economy. Regarding their sort of adventurism in the South China Sea, I don't know. I mean, I could see it going two ways. One, that they would foresee sort of inattention on the part of their neighbors who are distracted with the pandemic, as well as the United States, and use it as an opportunity to sort of reinforce their holdings in that region and their influence in that region. Alternatively, they could be so caught up in what's going on at home. I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's program. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning in, and we'll make a recording of this program available on our website in the coming days. I'd also like to thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute for partnering with the Council on this program. And Rollie, thank you so much for sharing all of your insight with us and joining us.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be here. All my best to the Chicago Council and my friends at FPRI. Take care.